First there were arcade machines, large machines custom built to play one game. Then there were home video game consoles, small machines custom built to play one game and would connect to your TV to display the game. Then there were cartridge-based consoles, small generalized machines that use microprocessors to run a game stored as software on a cartridge. The first ever cartridge-based console was the Fairchild Channel F, short for Channel Fun. The Channel F was built by a man named Jerry Lawson. Jerry Lawson was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1940. He was interested in science from a young age, earning an amateur ham radio license at age 13, and in high school repairing TV sets for money. He attended Queens College and City College in New York, but never completed a degree. After college he worked at Grumman Aircraft, Federal Electric, and PRD Electronics. And then in the 70s he worked as an engineering consultant at Fairchild Semiconductor in San Francisco.
Fairchild's multitude of skilled and talented people tells a fascinating story about a company that's growing more diversified each day.
While he was working there, he created an arcade game called Demolition Derby in his garage. It was one of the first games ever to use a microprocessor instead of custom-built circuitry. He was also a member of the Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley, a now famous club from that era that had a lot of members in it who would go on to become prominent computer entrepreneurs, such as Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and John Draper. Jerry Lawson and Ron Jones were the only black members of the club. Quick side note on Ron Jones, in 1999 he would invent the Song Pro, a device that turns the Nintendo Game Boy into an MP3 player, and a later model of the Song Pro would turn it into a video player. But otherwise he didn't work in the games industry as far as I've found. Back to Jerry Lawson, in the mid-70s he was made chief hardware engineer at Fairchild and led development of the Channel F console. The idea of video game cartridges came from Wallace Krishner and Lawrence Haskell, who worked at Alpex Computer Corporation, who licensed the technology to Fairchild. Jerry Lawson and his team refined the technology and turned it into a commercial product that could be used by consumers. Lawson said it was actually more challenging designing products for consumers than it had been designing products for the military when he worked at Grumman Aircraft. Another problem was the tech was so new that every single cartridge had to be tested by the FCC. The Channel F was released in 1976 and sold for $169, equivalent to $759 today. It sold approximately 250,000 units before the Atari 2600 was released a year later and dominated the marketplace. In 1980, Lawson left Fairchild and founded Videosoft, a game company that would make game cartridges for the Atari 2600. 5 years later, Videosoft closed down and he started doing consulting work. He later worked with Stanford's Mentor program and worked with kids to put 2 satellites in space. He sadly passed away in 2011. A couple years before his death, he did a great interview with Vintage Computing where he talked about his life and experiences in the industry and his thoughts on modern video games. I'll link it in the description. I was really starting to get jaded by answering the phone, right? One woman called up really irate and she said, "My game hums, do you know why?" And I said, "Because it doesn't know the words, lady." A couple years after the Channel F was released, another black engineer by the name Ed Smith was working on a cartridge-based game system called the MP1000. Ed Smith grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, New York, and was determined to use engineering and tech skills to escape. After high school, he got married and started studying electrical engineering at New York City Community College. He did a lot of tech jobs after, like wiring alarm systems and security systems with cameras. Then he started working at Marblite where he tested traffic signals, which is where he got introduced to microprocessors. Marblite's traffic signals actually used a Fairchild processor, the same model as the one used on the Channel F. In 1976, he joined APF, a company that made calculators. The company was wanting to get into video games. Ed Smith's first project there was to build a prototype for their game console MP1000. He took a handwritten schematic designed by the engineering team and built a prototype from it. After design was complete, his job switched to being a playtester, where he had to complete every game for the console on every difficulty level. The company also had a bunch of spares of the console in storage that were used for demonstrations or testing. He would often take one back home and give it to someone in the projects as a way to introduce people there to technology. The MP1000 did well and took 10 to 15% of the market while going against Atari and other machines. APF's next project was a computer called the Imagination Machine. Ed Smith was again given engineering schematics and built and tested the prototype from them. He went to the Consumer Electronics Show where APF showed off the Imagination Machine, and he said he was the one black person there out of the 50,000 people attending. The Imagination Machine would fail though, mainly because the marketing team had insisted on including a tape drive in it, but by the time the computer was ready for release, floppy drives had come out and no one wanted a computer with a tape drive anymore. This ended up causing the entire company of APF to collapse. Smith had switched to sales by the time APF collapsed, and afterwards he left and began working at Apple as a sales rep and then worked at a series of different tech companies. He's currently working at Infosys as a consultant and is retiring soon. In December 1982, Black Enterprise did an article featuring both Jerry Lawson and Ed Smith. Alright, moving from the console world, let's switch to the tabletop RPG world. In 1988, a pen and paper RPG called Cyberpunk was released by Tabletop Games. This would be the first edition of a game now known as Cyberpunk 2020, which is currently being adapted by CD Projekt Red into a computer RPG called Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk was designed and written by a man named Mike Pondsmith. Pondsmith was born into a military family. His father was an Air Force officer, and his mother was a psychologist. He went to college at the University of California, where he studied graphic design and behavioral psychology. He had been designing games since he was a kid, but it was in college that he got introduced to pen and paper role-playing games after his friend got a copy of Dungeons & Dragons. He liked D&D, but not its fantasy setting. Later on though, he'd get a copy of Traveller, which was a sci-fi tabletop RPG. He liked the setting but not the mechanics, so he rewrote them for personal use and renamed this version of the game Imperial Star. He started his career in the video games industry doing graphic design, where he repackaged Japanese games for Western market, and also later made designs for early Ultima games. Later he ran a typesetting business which gave him access to then high-tech software used for book and magazine layouts. He took advantage of this to write a game called Mechton, a Japanese mecha game based on Mobile Suit Gundam manga he'd stumbled upon in the past. What's interesting is that the manga were all in Japanese, which he couldn't read, so he attempted recreating its world's dynamics entirely from looking at the manga's imagery. Mechton would do well, which convinced Pondsmith that he could make a business out of game design. He ended up founding Tabletop Games in 1985. In 1988, through Tabletop Games, he would release Cyberpunk, the role-playing game of the dark future. Pondsmith designed it by attempting to replicate 1980s cyberpunk science fiction. Major inspirations were Walter John Williams' novel Hardwired and the movie Blade Runner. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Pondsmith would continue working on Cyberpunk by adding supplements and a new edition. At the same time, he did some work for TSR. He worked on a Buck Rogers RPG and 2 source books for Dungeons & Dragons. In 1994, he would release Castle Falkenstein, a steampunk fantasy RPG that used playing cards instead of dice, though would later be adapted to the GURP system. Castle Falkenstein was very well received and won multiple awards. In the late 90s, he took a break from tabletop RPGs and accepted a job at Microsoft, where he helped produce several games on the original Xbox. In 2004, he joined Monolith Productions, where he worked on The Matrix Online. In the early 2000s, he also started working on the 3rd edition of Cyberpunk. Like the previous editions, it was influenced by classic cyberpunk books like those by Neil Stephenson and William Gibson, but also took inspiration from a lot of other sources, including anime. Pondsmith wanted it to be a commentary on the 21st century, with corporate influences on everyday life, ideologies of groups, the place of government, warfare, and advancements in biotechnology. In 2012, he started work with CD Projekt Red on a game set in the cyberpunk universe, and they're still working on it together today. Alright, going back to the 90s, 2 black artists worked on Fallout, Robert Collier and Tramell Ray Isaac. Isaac went to the Joe Kuberi School in Dover, New Jersey and studied 2D animation. After he graduated, he started working at Tachyon Studios as an animator on a game called Blood and Magic. Tachyon Studios shut down right after Blood and Magic was released, and Isaac would go on to work at Interplay in 1996. He was responsible for drawing Vault Boy and Fallout. Vault Boy was originally designed by Leonard Boyarsky, but Isaac finalized the look of the character and drew a lot of the game manual art. Isaac went on to be the lead artist on Fallout 2 and also worked in senior art positions on many notable games such as Icewind Dale, Neverwinter Nights 2, and PlanetSide. More recently, he was an art director for Duke Nukem Forever and apparently was one of the people responsible for it actually getting finished. He was also art director on Lawbreakers. He is currently working in IllFonic on Predator Hunting Grounds and is pretty active on Twitter. He also gave a great talk at the White Knights conference in 2017 about his experiences in the game industry, which I definitely recommend listening to if you're wanting to go into the industry yourself. Robert Collier was the other black artist who worked on Fallout. He worked on Fallout 1 and 2, but then left Interplay to work for Sony Online Entertainment, where he still works today. Seems he's mostly worked on EverQuest. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find much info on him besides his LinkedIn. A couple other quick mentions. I found a black sound designer from the 90s named Orpheus Hanley. He was working as a music programmer in 1989 when he got the opportunity to record and direct voice actors for a game, which got him interested in working in the games industry. He started working at Sierra Online in 1990 and did sound design for a ton of their games, including the King's Quest series and the first Leisure Suit Larry. I haven't been able to find much info on him past the 2000s, but he is still working today and has his own studio. I also found a black designer and producer from the 90s named Morgan Gray. He helped design and playtest a bunch of Star Wars games in the late 90s and later went on to help produce a bunch of Tomb Raider games. He's currently working as an executive producer at Crystal Dynamics. Haven't been able to find much other information about him. Alright, moving into the 2000s, Eric Lang is a super accomplished board game and card game designer. He made the XCOM board game, Bloodborne card game, and Call of Cthulhu card card games. He started his career in games as a playtester at FASA, an American publisher of role-playing games, wargames, and board games, and he independently published his first game, Mystic, in 2000. Mystic is a fantasy card game based on tarot. It's reviewed alright with a 6.4 on Board Game Geek. It would go on to get a lot better at design though. If you scroll through games he's credited as a designer on, they slowly go from an average of 6 to an average of 7 to 8 and up. Also, he's credited on over 500 games, which is insane. There's a great interview with him on Board Game Quest, I'll link in the description. Auriea Harvey is an artist and game designer who works with her husband Michael Sameen to make art games, sort of avant-garde, unusual, non-traditional style games. The most well-known games she's worked on are The Path, which is a psychological horror game inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, and The Endless Forest, an MMO where you can't talk to other people but instead communicate with sounds and body language. Currently, she is a professor of games at Kunsthochschule Kassel, and she has a bunch of talks on game design available online. Alright, to close out this video, I wanted to shout out some cool black indie game devs you should follow. Salman Shuri, super talented, we collaborated on a jam video, I'll link at the top right. He's got a ton of really cool projects he's working on, you should follow him on Twitter for sure, and he also just recently lost his job unfortunately because of the pandemic, so consider backing his Patreon if you can. Jabril's, his video on making a game in 48 hours is what originally inspired me to look into doing YouTube seriously. It was the first time I saw a game dev video that wasn't a tutorial do well on YouTube. I hadn't thought that was possible before. He's got a bunch of cool videos on game dev, AI, and robotics. Endless Fluff is a New York-based game dev working on a really nice looking tactics game. Alex Francois is a writer and game dev who made The Slaughter, a noir point-and-click adventure game where you track down a serial killer. Mr. Tedders is a game dev who makes a lot of abstract art and games, very weird and very cool. The Dipod is a talented game dev and animator working on a fighting game. Mr. Din, pixel artist and game dev working on a Streets of Rage style beat 'em up. Alright, thanks for watching. If there are any black game devs you like to promote, or if you are one yourself, feel free to drop a link in the comments.